Hi and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller. This is a video about Unwin, who were a publisher who lasted for many decades. They're most famous for bringing J.R.R. Tolkien to the world. And we're going to take a look at this Unwin fantasy fiction catalogue. And this was given to me by my friend Bob, Mr. Book 451, the dealer. There's a couple of videos on my channel where I visit his dealership and do book hauls and what have you. And you can sort of contact him there. I'll put the email address on the screen. And he gave me this last time I saw him. And even though I worked in the trade for a long time, I've never really kept a lot of ephemera of this kind. And I wish I had, because, you know, you don't think at the time what waves of nostalgia it will bring and what fun you'll have later on. So as I say, George and Unwin were the publishers of Tolkien. And you know, they initially, like most publishers, did just hardcovers, but as time moved on they went into paperbacks, and this sort of showcases their list circa 83-84, and they had a fantasy imprint called Unicorn. And I'm going to show you some of the actual books, so I've got lots of them. And at this time they were sort of taken on board by a young publisher called Jane Johnson, and Jane's a friend of mine. We've known each other since the late 80s. We don't see each other very often. We're in contact online a fair whack, and I would do an interview with her on the channel because she's a writer as well, but she lives in Cornwall a lot of the time and doesn't have very good sort of broadband connections, so we can't actually do that. So hopefully at some point when we meet up we'll be able to film a proper interview. So this is a look at that, and she was working on this list from sort of this period onwards. And she is a little bit older than me by about 2 or 3 years, and she's a great lady. So this is sort of what was happening when she was looking after things. And as you see, this sort of double page spread here looks at a book called Castles, illustrated by Alan Lee. Now, of course, Alan Lee was the person who first did profusely illustrated Tolkien books for Unwin back in the 80s. And of course, he did lots of the concept art for the film versions by Peter Jackson. And Castles was a book which was always around then. I never remember selling it very much, but it is absolutely beautiful stuff. And it also mentions this book here, The High Kings, by Joy Chant, who was somebody signed to Unwin, and I don't remember that one at all. So that's 1983. That's kind of before my time, really. So that's an interesting one. I've no memory of that whatsoever. So what you see here then turning over is a double page spread looking at their then new full colour illustrated by Michael Haig version of The Hobbit, which I remember really well and used to sell all the time. Beautiful stuff, and that was new at that point. 1984, hardback, 11.95. So yeah, so this is pretty much at the point I came into the industry. Also new at that period was the Book of Lost Tales, and yeah, gosh, this really takes me back. Lost Tales 1, 1983, and Lost Tales 2, 1984, with Tolkien's own sort of initial sigil there, which I also thought was really clever, the way he put the J, the R and the T together. And for me, with Tolkien, it's as much about the iconography as the writing. I'm not a massive fan of the writing, but I do like the iconography and his sort of sheer bravura and skill and style of world building, which is just fantastic. You know, you have to admit it's a incredible thing. So yeah, so that's a look at that. And you see, this is A4 full color, and it's very beautiful. I'm always going to keep this because it just takes me back to those days. So this is what a look at what Unicorn, the fantasy imprint of Unwin, were doing in paperback. Now, what's interesting about this is that they fundamentally did books in B format, which is the larger format rather than the small one. And I'll just see if I can fish one out now to show you. This is one of the books from that time, The Frozen City by David R. Scott and David J. Marl. And let's see, when does this date from? And this says in a B format. And I'll show you what that means in a moment. Let's just look at the colophon, the printing history. 84 on hardcover, 1985. Now, what you'll see here, this is one of their slightly later A format books. That's The Ice Monkey by M. John Harrison. And you see the size difference. Now, the B format is the format which most paperbacks are now. Even genre paperbacks would be in B format. In those days, that was relatively uncommon and usual. The standard format for SF and fantasy was the A. So you notice the difference there. So that's typical of what they were doing. So they did rather stand out because most genre books then were in the smaller format, and the black livery was quite unusual. But I have great memories of these, and that one retails for £2.95. So that sort of shows you what they were doing. And across the board here, as you see, there's all sorts of different titles. And I'm just going to pull this a bit closer. because there are really classic things like James Branch Cabell's Figures of Earth, which is a book which dates back to the 1920s. Brand new things by Joy Chant, who is a fairly obscure figure now. The Last Unicorn by Peter Beagle, which has been reissued in recent years and is in all the reference books. You'll also see things like Monkey, which of course was a TV series back in that time, and that's been reissued as a Penguin Clothbound classic. King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany, which is a pre-Tolkien thing. Asgard by Nigel Frith, which was an sort of interesting sort of way to try and bring in the Nordic thing more definitively, and something that Unwin did. They were quite innovative under Jane's leadership, and they did all sorts of things which didn't quite take off. You'll see they also did Tanith Lee, John Harrison, and these anthologies in Lands of Never, and they were edited by Maxim Jakubowski, who like me contributes to Deep Ends, the J.G. Ballard Memorial Anthology, and the prices here kind of come in between £2.50 and £2.95 generally. So that shows you. And forthcoming in 1985, they were doing a push on Barbara Hambley, who got quite big actually, and also on Mary Mackey. I don't remember that at all. Heart's Hope, an early Orson Scott Card, and that's before Ender's Game got really big. Gwyneth Jones' Divine Endurance, which I have here somewhere in hardcover, and this book, The Badger of Gissy by Wolf von Nebelschetz, which I don't recall at all. That's an obscure one. So this shows the kind of thing they were doing, and very beautiful, as you can see. Here's an overview of their Tolkien backlist, and as you see, they did lots and lots and lots. And what happened to Unwin is in the late 80s, they were swallowed up by HarperCollins. Now, HarperCollins' main SF imprint then was Panther, and Panther came under the Granada and then Grafton imprint. Panther had been a separate thing for many years, going right back to the late 50s, and then it became synonymous with SF in the 60s, and it was then bought by the Granada company, which included the TV production company, and in the early 80s, Collins, now called HarperCollins, bought Granada and changed the imprint's name to Grafton because it was based at Grafton Street. And then when Collins acquired Unwin, because they wanted the Tolkien estate, obviously who wouldn't, they sort of took her over, and her background, her academic background, was in Old English and Icelandic and those sort of things. She really knows her stuff. She's the real thing, you know, she's a proper scholar. And she absolutely loved Tolkien and loved fantasy writing and did some herself. She co-wrote some cat fantasies under the name Gabriel King with John Harrison. And she also wrote fantasy novels under the name Jude Fisher, and she writes historical romances, which of the more sophisticated kind, under her own name these days. And yeah, so she went over to Collins with this list, and so the liveries of the books changed from Unwin to basically the Tolkien list, which is part of Collins. So you can get to see what they look like back there in the mid 80s, and I've got such vivid memories of all of these. Really takes me back. And as you see, they were mostly sort of B format books, which is interesting. So the hardcovers and the paperbacks. Then I'm going to just fold this out, and here they also did some fantasy role-playing books, sort of game-playing books, which I must say I do not recall at all. They may be on my time. This is this sort of original fantasy in hardback. These were hardcovers they did as originals, and you see the Frozen City is there. I would like a copy of the Frozen City in hardcover. It's very hard to come by, especially in good nick. And they also did The Summer Tree by Guy Gavriel Kay. Now, Guy Gavriel Kay worked on the Tolkien manuscripts for things like the Silmarillion, I believe, with Christopher Tolkien, and this was the first of his trilogy, and these were massive. They were so big in the 80s. They were part of the boom, and they had beautiful covers, and yeah, you know, he's good little writer, and these were sort of probably their biggest breakthrough success beyond Tolkien, because even though they had writers who I would say technically better, like the very wonderful Colin Greenland, who is a scholar of New Wave SF, very elegant, subtle, clever fantasy novels. They also had John Harrison as well, the Verconian books, which is the sort of the anti-Tolkien really. There were other things too, like this one here, Greenside, Angela Shackleton Hill. I have no memory of that whatsoever, so I must look out for that, because you do get interested in the things that you missed, you know. So that one, as I say, don't remember that at all. So these are all 1984 hardcovers. Graham Desmond Martin, Scott's SF and fantasy writer. You do see that about. Probably the book in terms of critical acclaim which has lasted the most in this is Divine Endurance by Gwyneth Jones, which has a little cat on the cover. and that's usually between 30 and 50 quid in hardback. And you see some other ones mentioned there as well. And yeah, it's interesting. It mentions another Arscott and Marr, which I don't remember at all, A Flight of Bright Birds, so I must look for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this over. You can see there's the order form. So that's what we used to do back in the day. You'd had a little thing called a teleordering machine, which was like a computer keyboard, and it was sort of preset. You type in the International Standard Book numbers of the books, and I'll show you them now. Just interestingly there, it says ISBN prefix 004. So all the Unwin books would be 004, and then the rest of the number would be there. And you type that number in, type your quantity, hit a button, and it would go off through the modem down the telephone line. So it's very sort of primitive sort of thing. But what you'd also do is you'd have multiple copies of this in this tiny little box here. You would write in the quantity, you just scribble it in and put a circle around it, and you just pop this in the post, off to the publisher. And this one here is actually for the ordinary people, the man in the street, you guys out there, just to send off. So this is someone you would pick up in the bookshop. It's not officially a catalogue in the book selling sense, but it is basically what we would have used in the trade at the time as well. But of course their catalogue would have had all their other books, not just their fantasy. So you can see all the other stuff there, the hardbacks and the paperbacks, and they're looking here. So on the back at Christmas gifts. So this is the end of 84. You can see the Tolkien calendar for 85, the idea of the slipcase set, what you could get, the Father Christmas letters there in hardcover. So that was the sort of promotional thing that was given away in bookshops to book buyers on the street, and the traders, they used it as well for Unwin in sort of late 84. Isn't that nice? I'll show you some of the books now. Started to become less of an imprint. They started doing more SF, because lots of good SF around then. Something they did, they launched an imprint called Orion, nothing to do with the big publishing company Orion later on. And Orion, they didn't do a lot of books. This is an A format edition of the mid-70s M. John Harrison space opera classic, The Centauri Device. I really dislike this cover, and I've had this ever since, and I can't bear to part with it, because first of all, it's signed. Mike Harrison signed it for me. Steve, many thanks. Bath 89, that's when we did. It also mentions the video we're doing, which is dedicated to Steve and Pat as well, my partners. So there you go. So that's the sort of thing they were doing in this sort of A format. So that was the sort of SF imprint, and there's the publisher symbol there, the Unwin symbol there. And they also did M. John Harrison's early Viraconian books. They reissued these, Pastel City and A Storm of Wings, in A formats again, and these are kind of like the anti-Tolkien. And if you are interested, do watch my top 10 sword and sorcery video, which is my most popular video, my most watched video. And again, these are signed, and I had earlier editions which were in a real state, and I've kept these ever since, as they do take me back to those times. And it has to be said, Storm of Wings is one of the most difficult books to read you'll ever come across. It's very rewarding. So they were doing these things in A format, the smaller format. And recently, for M. John Harrison fans, I'm just going to show you two books I've acquired for what I call my final library, my definitive collection. I've sort of come across these in the last year. This one only in the last 2 weeks. Are the hardcover first editions of these books, which are very uncommon in the UK. This is the Pastel City, published in Doubleday. This is the first edition from about 75. Or is it earlier? It's an ex-library one, so it's not in fantastic nick, but it's not bad. 72, good grief. And yeah, that's really, really something. I acquired that recently, very pleased with that. So that shows you what that looked like back in the day. And this is probably about more like 8 months to a year ago. I managed to get the hardcover of Storm of Wings, which is that one there. And that again is Doubleday. That's a few years later. And Mike Harrison told me that he wrote this book with a typewriter balanced on his knees, sitting behind the counter in Savoy Books, Manchester. There is a video about Savoy Books and the banning in the UK of works by Samuel R. Delany and Charles Plattner. I talk about that sort of anecdote there as well. So that's just for the M. John Harrison fans. And interestingly, of course, Unwin had already done in this format, they'd done the two later Viraconian books, in Viraconium and Viraconium Nights, which are presented here in Gollanc's first edition. So I now have a complete set in pretty much the same format. They're demis. all the same format, the entire series, which has really pleased me because they're amongst my favourite fantasy books of all time. They really are quite brilliant. So yes, they were doing these sort of A format things. They did some work with some fairly refined fantasy writers, and Colin Greenland I mentioned, and this is one which is in this leaflet, which is Daybreak on a Different Mountain. Very, very beautiful, and as you see, it's got a sort of Eastern feel about it, and this is a demi format hardcover, and that's in, I'd say, in this leaflet. And interestingly, the other one is a smaller format that's more like an octavo, so there you go, and really, really beautiful, as you can see. And this was the third book that Colin did for Unwin, Other Voices, which is great, such a great book. And they're a kind of loose trilogy really, but that's the thing, you know, he's sort of subtle writer. He was a critic of new wave science fiction. He wrote the definitive book on new wave SF, and you know, he his partner Susanna Clarke, who wrote Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, he wrote one of the big space operas of the late 80s in the British space opera renaissance, which is called Take Back Plenty. And he also named the generation of interzone writers as Gene Rats, a label which never caught on. And there's a video about Gene Rats on my channel as well. So I will do some of Colin's work at some point because I really like it, but there's very little of it. And as you see, very, very beautiful, really sort of plain. And you notice the changes, I see, in format, and this one is George Allen Unwin Hyman. You see that the identity gradually changes, and then you get this little chap in the circle there. So there was sort of constant change over the years of the way the books looked, really. Somebody else who I'm very keen on and who has just had his 82nd birthday and published 82 books is Garry Kilworth. And Garry began his career in the sort of early 70s in SF, and you know, he's a really, really good writer and a little discussed these days. And he was initially with Faber, and his early books are in Penguin paperbacks, and I'm rereading one at the moment, first time for years. I'm really enjoying it. But he then went over to Unwin, and this is Cloud Rock, and as you see, very sort of dark looking book, and this is a fantastic one set on a world like this, as you can see on the cover. And Garry really very naughty sort of prose. He wasn't afraid to tackle difficult things, and he's regarded by a lot of people quite minor, and his books are quite easy to get second hand, but I think they're underrated. And he was very, very fine, and he was sort of like sort of last generation sort of new wave, or just post new wave. He and Robert Holdstock were contemporaries, very friendly with Christopher Priest, not very English at his school. And Gary's great stuff. And just to show you what they did then a little later, changed their livery to this wonderful, beautiful white, really classy looking. And again, they were just too classy, I think, for the mass market. And they did this in hardcover and paperback, and they did a few other things. This is Abandoned Arty, which again is a near future sort of SF novel about outsiders. All the sort of rich people have disappeared, and there's only the outcasts and the poor people left on Earth. This has got a very light and playful tone, and this for me was seeing where Garry was going to go in his work beyond that in the late 80s. This is sort of mid 80s, about 86, 87, and where he was going. And yeah, really, really good writer. And he did lots of children's books. He can write pretty much anything. He's massively talented. And this is one I got from a dealer. He's written in it to Andy. You know, Andy is, don't read this, it's depressing. It's actually quite an upbeat book, despite 88, despite the sort of depressing sort of setup to begin with. You know, it's one of his lighter and more sort of life-affirming books, but it shows you the beauty of that livery. Really, really nice. And they did lots of these. I don't have many because I'm very much a cherry picker. My friend Graham, the other grumpy old man on the channel, he's probably got all of these. I'll show you one more. This is a very uncommon book, a short story collection with some of her best stories. Tanith Lee, who was Anne Rice before Anne Rice was, you know, she was like the queen of goth before goth was a thing. And this is Forests of the Night. And one of these days will probably knock you back about 120 quid if you can find one, and you struggle to find one in that condition, I can tell you now. But as you see, very beautiful books. So Jane and the team at Unwin with the designs, they tried all sorts of different things to get their books selling, and they used to tick over, and they had some successes. Of course, Tolkien sort of fueled it all, but they never had the sort of mass sales they should have had. Going back a bit, another book which is referred to in this leaflet, let's take a look. Let's see. And I think it mentions here, forthcoming in 1985, The Wario Carried Life by Jeff Ryman. Canadian writer, largely lived in Britain for a very long time. This is his first novel. Jeff spent a lot of time living in the Far East, Cambodia, written a great mainstream novel about that. This is one of his early books, his first one. Really great stuff. Lovely, lovely man. First thing I read by him was a short story called Oh Happy Day, which was in Interzone, the first anthology, which was published by Unwin, I seem to remember. And yeah, very beautiful stuff, and I really like his stuff. The early books are all very fleet and short, and they have a really great fabular feel, and wonderful writing. He really is great. His big crossover hit was about 98. He did a book called 253, which is about 253 people sitting in the same tube train and their individual stories, and it's very clever, and that was his sort of mainstream success. And he's still writing now, you know, and absolutely beautiful stuff, as you can see. What else did they do? Well, somebody that they mentioned somewhere in this, obviously we mentioned Divine Endurance by Gwyneth Jones. They mentioned here somewhere that this would be a forthcoming book. That's Escape Plans by Gwyneth Jones. She now has 2 books in Golanc's Masterworks SF. Kairos, which was in this this white livery when it first appeared, and I don't have that edition. I've got the Masterworks one, and also White Queen, which was the first of an Alien Invasion trilogy, and she's very acclaimed. I find her very spiky. My sort of jury is out on her. I need to read more of her work, and I bought this a while ago purely for nostalgia reasons, and this one's got a terribly brown text block, but I saw one in Oxfam in Bath the other day, and it was better condition than this, and they wanted 50 quid for it, which is like a bit steep. You know, I'd say 40 is more like it, really. So yes, and this again is more of an Orion one, even though it says Alan Unwin on the spine. But yeah, very handsome. So it shows you the sort of thing they were doing. Just one more, I think, from those days to give you an idea of the breadth of what Unwin did and the quality. This is The Dream Years by Lisa Goldstein, which I read at the time, and I need to reread because it's been a long, long time. And this is a fantasy novel set in the world of the Parisian surrealists between 1900 and 1920. And, you know, I have to say it was really good. And surrealism is a kind of obvious venue to write a fantasy novel in, really. It's got all sorts of fascinating hallucinatory time slip stuff in it. What I would say is that Robert, the central character, who's a surrealist poet, I seem to recall, he's rather gentle for a surrealist, possibly reflecting Goldstein's more feminist approach to the material, or feminine approach to the material. I think had a man written this, it'd have been a good deal tougher and more libidinal, and I think that would have worked better. But beautiful book, as you can see. So that's a little look back at what Unwin were doing then. I'm very nostalgic about them. They were great days for me. I was young, I was better looking, you know, I was really immersed in my job in bookselling, and there was some fantastic stuff going on in the 80s, both fantasy and SF, and elsewhere as well. It was an exciting time in British publishing. So that's a look at Unwin. Hope you've enjoyed that. I'll be doing some more publisher-centric things, both alone and with my friend Graham, because, you know, if you love books, you do start to develop a certain feel towards publishers, and if you work in the book trade, obviously you have a different relationship with them, and you really see how certain lists are curated and grow, and what the successes and failures are. So it's nice to look back on that. And as I say, Unwin were bought up by Collins, now HarperCollins, because Collins merged with Harper and Row, the US company, and Unwin was swallowed up, and they took the list, and there we go. And Jane, who was running it, went on to great things, and she eventually ended up as George R.R. Martin's UK editor. Great stuff. Bye for now.